Why do deep minds frighten society so much that it pushes them into isolation? There is a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from seeing what others refuse to see. It is not a defect, and it is not arrogance. It is a rare way of perceiving the world, and it always carries forms of sacrifice that you will understand as we move forward. Society avoids depth because it knows exactly what depth reveals about it. Deep thinkers are not rejected because they are wrong. They are rejected because they are right too early. The isolation you feel when you are misunderstood is not merely a failure of communication. It is often a deliberate exclusion, a quiet removal of the person who refuses to stay on the surface. Think of the last time you tried to hold a conversation that went beyond the obvious. Notice the resistance you awakened. Remember it without the weight of judgment. By the end of this video, you will realize that you are not nearly as alone as you think. Not after today, not anymore. Isolation is not the price you pay for thinking deeply. It is the condition that makes deep thought possible. There is an unbridgeable distance that opens by itself when you realize that a truth obvious to you is invisible to everyone else. Lucidity becomes a strangely silent territory, and speaking less turns into a survival strategy. The more your vision learns to see behind the social stage, the smaller the space becomes for sharing what you find. So the mind folds back into itself. You probably felt that invisible break only days ago, maybe yesterday, when you tried to express an idea that, to you, explained the core of a problem. In return, you received an evasive answer, a dense silence, or such a forced change of subject that you immediately felt out of place. That disconnection is proof that lucidity, when offered to someone who prefers illusion, creates instant tension. This is the fundamental paradox of the conscious mind. The more you understand, the smaller your community becomes. Arthur Schopenhauer, the 19th century philosopher who stripped away the fantasies of human optimism, argued that high intelligence is not a tool for social success, but a sentence that separates those who see reality too clearly. For him, that inner voice that cannot stop dissecting every gesture, analyzing the hidden motives behind false politeness, and questioning the pillars others accept blindly, carries a definitive weight. It turns coexistence into constant performance. The deep mind seeks the root because it never mastered the art of remaining on the surface, that exclusive territory where the crowd manages to feel safe. Look at your daily environment, and it becomes easy to see how shared spaces reward absolute certainty, however empty it may be. Charisma and crude simplification capture attention, while thought that works with nuance is pushed aside as boring, negative, or unnecessary. You can probably identify right now in your workplace or on your social feeds someone who gathers influence and applause by repeating basic slogans, while your more complex and accurate observations are met with indifference. Collective dynamics naturally gravitate towards sellers of illusion and motivators who say exactly what other people's fear needs to hear. It is the victory of blind confidence over analysis, a phenomenon that pushes the rigorous thinker aside, because most people prefer a lie that stabilizes their world to a truth that forces them to reevaluate their lives. From Schopenhauer's perspective, isolation is the logical result of refusing to take part in a theater of prefabricated certainties. The environment does understand the depth of your arguments, at least enough to sense the danger in them. What horrifies people is not your darkness, but the light your clarity throws onto their own evasions. Your presence exposes the shortcuts, the borrowed opinions, the emotional bargains they use to keep daily life bearable. So they call you intense, difficult, negative, or strange. They make it sound as if the problem is your tone, your timing, or your inability to relax. But often the real offense is simpler. You interrupted the collective agreement to stay asleep. Your isolation is not proof that your mind is defective. It may be the cost of refusing to betray what you see, even when seeing it leaves you alone. And that loneliness has a deeper function. The presence of enormous physical strength instantly awakens admiration in others, while the display of great wealth often produces envy or the desire to imitate it. But meeting a mind that thinks at a much higher level changes the entire social dynamic. It activates an immediate defensive response. This is the mirror effect. The moment a deep thinker stops being merely a source of ideas and becomes a surface reflecting the intellectual limits of everyone around them. Most people can tolerate someone having more money, better clothes, or a stronger body, because those advantages still feel external. They can be gained, lost, copied, or dismissed without touching the core of who a person believes they are. Intelligence works differently. The way someone thinks, the beliefs they defend, and the particular lens through which they interpret reality form the center of their private identity. When a deep thinker dismantles faulty logic or questions a certainty everyone else has accepted, the other person often experiences the analysis as an attack on their own existence. At that point, the debate stops being a confrontation of ideas and becomes a conflict between egos, where truth becomes secondary. Society rejects in the analytical mind the exact parts of its own confusion it would rather keep hidden. It projects outward the discomfort created by not having answers. You may remember a recent meeting where your mere presence or one restrained comment changed the atmosphere. Nothing you said was aggressive, yet the room tightened. That silent rejection was not about your argument. It was about the gap your clarity opened in their sense of safety. Faced with that threat, the collective mind automatically activates a mechanism of self-preservation and closes the door to real dialogue. Natural curiosity gives way to blind resistance. The wish to understand is replaced by the need to dismiss the speaker quickly before the group has to examine itself. A study from Stanford University observed how threat responses shift depending on the size of the social setting. In private, one-to-one exchanges, the danger often drops because each person's status is protected from the gaze of the crowd. You can verify this in your own life. Your most honest and meaningful conversations have probably happened in private, in the safety of a quiet room, a walk, or a late message where no audience was watching. The same people who would listen carefully alone may become evasive in a group. In large collective spaces, protecting reputation becomes the dominant force. The initial politeness towards the deep thinker turns into coordinated distance, not because the ideas are false, but because accepting them would cost too much socially. Behind this resistance to lucidity, there is not merely a difference of opinion. There is an older biological impulse regulating survival inside the tribe. To agree with the person who sees too much can mean separating from the group, and the nervous system still reads separation as danger. That is why depth unsettles people. Before they even understand it, it threatens belonging. It disturbs the shared fiction that everyone is safe because everyone is seeing the same thing. The deep thinker breaks that spell by pointing to what the group has agreed not to notice. And once the spell is broken, society rarely thanks the one who broke it. It sends them back into silence, where clarity survives inside them, lonely, intact, and sharper than before. Modern neuroscience confirms that the brain can process a brilliant argument with the same alarm code it uses for a physical attack. When someone meets a line of reasoning beyond their processing capacity, the amygdala can register danger and shut down higher logic. Deep thought can trigger real biological panic, a visceral reaction that explains why another person's lucidity can provoke such disproportionate hostility in certain social settings. Those who dare to look beyond the obvious awaken a defense mechanism similar to the one produced by the presence of a predator. That chemical alarm turns the analytical thinker into a physical threat to the emotional stability of the group, a danger the community tries to neutralize through immediate isolation. The ancient tribal brain offers the evolutionary explanation for this rejection. For millions of years, human beings survived in small bands, where internal cohesion and repeated shared beliefs protected the clan from external threats. Dissent, or the questioning of common rules, endangered the group's stability, which made intellectual deviation almost equivalent to a death sentence by expulsion. Evolution trained the mind to prioritize social acceptance over objective truth, a biological wiring that punishes independent clarity. The mind that cannot stop questioning, that rejects established molds and notices cracks in the collective story, can experience its own lucidity as a factory defect, something that condemns it to exile. The deep thinker interrupts that ancestral balance, forcing the group to choose between the comfort of shared illusion and the painful uncertainty of reality. Resistance to complexity intensifies because of a basic cognitive principle: cognitive ease. The brain consumes enormous daily energy, so it prefers information that is simple, predictable, and familiar, because that reduces metabolic cost. When an idea demands greater analytical effort, the nervous system can classify it as hostile to its own efficiency. This search for biological shortcuts explains why depth often creates discomfort instead of curiosity. You can verify the pattern by reviewing the simple content you consume when tired, confirming that the mind seeks the relief of the superficial before the strain of rigorous analysis. The social environment rejects complex ideas partly to protect its mental reserves, fleeing any concept that forces people to think for themselves. Collective submission hardens through groupthink and system justification theory. People would rather absorb absurd beliefs and defend social structures that harm them than risk the isolation produced by public questioning. The fear of exclusion is so severe that the crowd becomes the fiercest guardian of the status quo, attacking anyone who tries to dismantle inherited truths. These two psychological barriers build an almost impenetrable wall around collective illusions, protecting them from disruptive thought. Cognitive biases operate like an integrated security system, preferring suffering under a familiar lie to the freedom of an unknown truth. These everyday patterns shape the behavior of modern institutions. In companies, classrooms, families, and online communities, the same reflex appears. The person who simplifies is promoted, while the person who reveals complexity is treated as a threat to morale. The institution calls it harmony, but often it is only collective avoidance wearing polite language. The deep thinker is not expelled because the group has disproved them. They are expelled because their presence forces the group to feel the cost of not thinking. And once that cost becomes visible, someone has to be blamed. So the one who asked the question becomes the problem, while the structure that feared the answer remains untouched. This is why lucidity so often ends in silence, not because the truth is weak, but because the tribe, at its core, is still afraid of it. The Dunning-Kruger effect exposes one of the bleakest dynamics in human coexistence. People with the weakest analytical capacity often overestimate their own intelligence. Those who see only the surface move through life armored with absolute certainty, unaware of their limits, while deep thinkers tend to question their conclusions because they understand the vastness of what they do not know. This asymmetry creates a draining daily friction, turning the most ignorant members of a community into the harshest judges and the first to dismiss any rigorous argument. You can probably name someone in your workplace or family who speaks with unshakable confidence about subjects they barely understand, and somehow their simple opinion carries more social weight than your careful reflections. Social circles reward that empty boldness and push the methodical thinker towards the edges of conversation. The disconnection deepens through the status quo bias and the backfire effect, two mechanisms that protect mental stability from change. The mind prefers familiar ideas over new truths, treating the known as a safe shelter to be defended at any cost. When you try to dismantle a social myth with undeniable evidence, the other person often does not change position. Instead, a psychological armor forms around the original false belief. Remember a recent argument where you offered solid reasoning and the other person became even more rigid. Every attempt to raise the level of debate becomes a trigger for hostility, turning precision into fuel for another person's ignorance. Digital platforms amplify this structural rejection through algorithms that prioritize immediate conflict over patient reflection. The online ecosystem rewards simplified, emotional fragments, a format that spreads quickly while nuanced explanations are buried for lack of instant reactions. Social media is built to feed constant agitation, trapping attention in a loop of shallow stimulus that prevents critical thought from settling. The person who seeks depth faces a cruel dilemma. Distort the idea until it fits the mold of rapid consumption, or accept digital invisibility. In that environment, the loudest sentence wins before the truest one has even gathered breath. This marginalization of disruptive thought reaches its strongest form in the institutions that organize collective life, where resistance to lucidity is normalized, rewarded, and sometimes written into procedure. Traditional education trains generations in memorization and passive learning, punishing the uncomfortable curiosity that questions the authority of the program. The modern corporate world follows the same logic by rewarding the obedient employee who adapts to company culture, while sidelining the innovator whose proposals threaten the established hierarchy. Politics operates through the same principle, elevating leaders who repeat the comforting speeches the crowd wants to hear, and excluding those who point to real crises that demand sacrifice. Institutions reject intelligence in the same way individuals do, not always through open persecution, but through polite containment. They create committees, delays, etiquette, and performance reviews to make dangerous clarity look disruptive, impatient, or unsuitable. The brilliant mind is rarely destroyed in one dramatic act. More often, it is exhausted slowly, asked to translate itself into language acceptable to people who benefit from not understanding. That is why so many sharp observers end up quiet, isolated, or strategically invisible. They learn that truth does not need only courage. It needs an environment capable of receiving it. And when that environment is missing, silence becomes a shelter. But the silence also records everything. It preserves the perceptions society rejected, waiting for a moment when the same world that feared depth will finally need the very mind it pushed away. That waiting is painful, but it keeps the flame of lucidity alive inside you now. Society loves deep thought only when it is safely sealed inside a coffin. The collective human mind struggles to tolerate lucidity while it is alive, speaking, and challenging the certainties of the present. It saves its applause and monuments for creators who can no longer disturb anyone. Across history, the pattern repeats with brutal precision. Genius is punished in the present and worshipped in the past. Once the author has been neutralized by time and the ideas have lost their immediate edge, you may recognize a smaller version of the same injustice in your own life. The proposal you offered, dismissed at once, only to see the same environment celebrated months later when someone else presented it as new. The list of those who paid the highest price for refusing to switch off their minds exposes the irrationality of this mechanism. Jesus of Nazareth shook the moral foundations of his age by challenging the religious and political structures around him, and paid for that audacity with public execution as a social agitator. Long before his message became an ethical pillar of the West, Socrates walked through Athens forcing citizens to examine their lives, a disturbance his democracy answered by sentencing him to drink hemlock for corrupting the young. Centuries later, Galileo Galilei was forced to kneel before a tribunal and deny with his own mouth the astronomical truth his eyes had verified through the telescope, saving his life by accepting the humiliation of silence. Friedrich Nietzsche spent his lucid years in extreme isolation, writing books almost no one bought. losing his mind without knowing that his notebooks would shape the philosophy of the following century. Nikola Tesla designed the planet's electrical future in a lonely room, dying in poverty while corporations built empires with technologies linked to his forgotten patents. Alan Turing broke the most complex wartime codes and helped save millions of lives, only to be persecuted and destroyed by the very state his intellect had rescued. Even in art, the pattern remains untouched. Vincent van Gogh pursued light through misery and public contempt, unaware that his cursed canvases would one day become priceless when he was no longer alive to sit at the table. Each of them inhabited a dense and prolonged darkness, carrying the weight of misunderstanding as if it were a corridor without an exit. They endured the demolition of their world without seeing the dawn of recognition, because recognition arrived only when the crowd felt safe enough to process what had once terrified it. The collective needs to strip truth of its human carrier before it can digest it without wounding the communal ego. A living thinker has a face, a voice, and a body that can still demand change. A dead thinker can be quoted, framed, simplified, and placed on a shelf. Once the person is gone, the truth becomes less dangerous because it no longer interrupts dinner, business, comfort, or inherited belief. A 19th century thinker observed this historical slaughter without sentimentality, building a philosophy that explained the loneliness of the sage not as an avoidable tragedy, but as a mathematical law of the spirit. From that perspective, the brilliant mind is not abandoned by accident. It is isolated because its presence destabilizes the arrangements that allow ordinary life to continue unquestioned. Society does not fear intelligence in the abstract. It fears intelligence while it is still breathing, still naming what everyone has agreed to ignore. That is why deep thinkers are praised too late. Their value becomes acceptable only after their danger has been removed from the room where decisions are made. Behind human actions, there is a blind and irrational force governing most people without their noticing it. A primitive impulse Schopenhauer called the will. This energy appears in the ordinary individual as the will to live, a biological need to seek crude pleasure, immediate comfort, and acceptance from the surrounding tribe at almost any cost. But a smaller group is ruled by a force of the opposite kind, the will to truth, an insatiable desire to understand reality without the social painkillers that soothe everyone else. That inner pressure that makes you analyze every detail, dismantle prefabricated stories, and question what has been accepted, even when it leaves you isolated, is the same force that prevents you from settling for the predictable answers around you. To live under the command of lucidity is to accept permanent conflict, because truth advances by destroying the comfortable certainties the crowd needs in order not to collapse. Someone governed by this analytical urgency develops a lasting inability to ignore the structural falseness on which ordinary coexistence rests. When you watch a social interaction, small talk immediately appears as rehearsed performance. Status games look like childish substitutes for thought. Polite dishonesty becomes the necessary lubricant that keeps empty bonds functioning. You probably remember a gathering this week where you found yourself participating mechanically in those rituals, smiling at a weightless comment or nodding before a fictional hierarchy, while feeling a deep inner estrangement. The deep thinker discovers himself as an intruder inside everyday theater, a conscious spectator who cannot enter the play without feeling that he is betraying his own intellectual nature. This clarity delivers a harsh verdict on emotional well-being, confirming Schopenhauer's claim that happiness and advanced intelligence often stand in inverse relation. Ignorance becomes the safest shelter for naive joy, while knowledge acts like a solvent that dissolves the illusions required to live in simple peace. Minds such as Nietzsche, Pascal, and Kafka suffered chronic torment because they could not half close their eyes before the emptiness of existence. Their lucidity was a fire that consumed the one who carried it. Schopenhauer summarized this reality by saying that a high degree of intellect tends to make a person unsociable, turning isolation into a technical refuge from generalized mediocrity. The philosopher proposed a survival strategy that redefines isolation, transforming solitude into an intellectual privilege and the essential space for independent creation. Letting go of the expectation that an environment unable to process your depth will validate you is the first step towards authentic freedom. You may remember a recent moment of isolation when, instead of experiencing abandonment as punishment, you felt the absolute relief of recovering your own mental axis. Genius hits a target no one else can see, and that demands a wise reserve towards the world, managing your light, guarding your energy, and choosing your listeners with surgical precision. The rigorous analyst's real crossroads is not solved by merely managing relationships with others, but by learning to manage the fracture that truth introduces into his own identity. Because the same lucidity that separates you from the crowd can also divide you from yourself. Part of you wants belonging, ease, and ordinary warmth. Another part refuses to betray what it sees. The work is not to amputate either side, but to hold both without surrendering your center. Isolation becomes destructive only when it turns into bitterness. Used consciously, it becomes a chamber where the mind cleans its vision, strengthens its language, and learns when silence is wisdom rather than defeat for you now. Why do deep minds frighten society so much? The answer may be that the collective environment does not really fear the analytical thinker's intelligence. It fears what that clarity reveals about its own darkness. Your lucidity acts like a spotlight, exposing the falsehoods most people need in order to get through the day. You become a mirror no one wants to face. When that outer cancellation becomes constant, the friction stops feeling like a communication problem and becomes a devastating doubt about your own sanity. Eventually, you reach the breaking point, where accumulated rejection forces the most uncomfortable question of all. Not whether your arguments are valid, but whether you have the right to perceive reality in that way. You may remember a silent night, when the weight of fitting into no conversation made you think you were broken, as if lucidity itself were a defect separating you from the human condition. Yet expulsion from the tribe contains the bitterest medicine, and the only force powerful enough to make you build a center of gravity that depends entirely on your own axis. When the possibility of receiving applause closes, you are left alone before the mirror of solitude. There you finally discover who you are when you stop performing to satisfy other people's expectations. Looking back at your loneliest periods, you can see that your most honest certainties and real strengths were born in those deserts, where nobody was validating you. Social contempt becomes a chisel, cutting away the excess need to please and forcing the mind to stand over its own abyss without reaching for a prefabricated shelter. There is one last illusion that must fall: the idea that the desert is an unjust curse, or a punishment imposed by other people's blindness. Isolation is the necessary condition for deep thought to happen. It is the sterile ground where consciousness is forced to mature by its own means. Without rejection from the clan, you would remain trapped in the blind repetition of inherited dogmas, dissolving your critical capacity in the comfort of belonging. Your difference is the beginning of the oldest and hardest journey an awakened mind can take. To endure the suffering of seeing too much is to accept that inner fracture as the price of a transmutation taking place in the thickest darkness. It is time to release the demand to be understood by structures that need lies in order to survive. Let the agitation of the analytical voice dissolve into silent observation of its own processes. Stop fighting for a seat at the banquet of common certainties. Consciousness then finds its own center, discovering its origin in the same space where the tribe declared you foreign. From there, solitude no longer feels like exile. It becomes a chamber of refinement, a place where perception stops begging for permission. You still may ache for companionship, but you no longer trade clarity for acceptance. You learn to speak when the listener can receive truth, and to remain silent when silence protects the flame. Behind the discursive noise that keeps searching for explanations, an untamable stillness waits. It knows exactly who is speaking when everyone else has fallen silent. And that concludes our video. If you enjoyed the content as much as we did, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss a single episode. Leave a comment below. We'd love to hear your feedback and suggestions for future videos. And don't forget to turn on notifications to stay up to date with all our updates. Thanks for being part of our community. See you in the next video.